Today you're all here to listen to Julie Suhr, professor in the Department of Psychology, and her topic is minimizing dementia risk. Some things are in your lifetime control. Welcome, Julie. The lecturn's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much. I very much look forward to talking to you. I recognize some folks out there. Very happy to see that we've got the full lifetime age spectrum, at least from adulthood forward, represented in the audience. Hopefully that was because of my very clever title. I also thank you for coming because we're competing with Rufus's birthday bash, apparently in the ballroom. If you think that's where you are not. There will not be a mascot, thank goodness. I do not like mascots. But that's a talk for another day, anxiety and phobias. Today we're going to talk about minimizing dementia risk. Some things are in your lifetime control. My area of study within psychology is clinical neuropsychology. That is a specialty that's specifically focused on brain injury, brain illness, brain disorders, and how they then affect your cognitive skills, your psychological skills, your behavior. And in particular, we've been doing research in my lab. I came in 1997, and we've been focusing quite a bit of our research in the aging space. So looking specifically at age-related cognitive changes that occur, because some just occur naturally with age. And I joke with my students all the time that I now qualify for all of our studies. It was only some in the past, and now it's all of them. So I've aged through my own research. But we also study signs of dementia, the earliest possible signs of dementia. Can we predict who goes on to develop dementia? In the process of doing that, we have offered free dementia screens to the broader Southeast Ohio community, as well as we've got some virtual studies that we started during COVID, so we've been able to reach all over the state of Ohio, doing tele-assessments that provide free dementia screens with clinical feedback. So in the area of psychology, we like to talk about being scientists, practitioners, and that my research really represents both sides of that. My clinical interests and my science interests are in this space. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and we're going to start with why would we be worried about such a topic? Well, worldwide, there are 55 million people living with Alzheimer's and other dementias. Alzheimer's dementia in particular is the most common of the dementias. It is the most researched. And so a lot of the research I'm going to talk about today, research from other labs as well as research that we've done in our lab, is focused more on Alzheimer's dementia. But clearly it's a global problem. Here in the US, you can see from this graphic, about 7 million people live with Alzheimer's dementia today. This is 2024 data. And those folks, this represents folks that are 65 and above, because that is the more age-typical onset for Alzheimer's dementia. Now, there are a lot of risk factors for dementia, and some are not really in your control. So the first one we think of that's not really in your control, and one that people tell me all the time, and now I'm starting to live it a little bit, is age. That it is true, the older you get, the more likely you are to develop dementia, including Alzheimer's dementia. As was seen in the last slide, there were an increasingly large number of individuals in different age groups, such that most Alzheimer's dementia is 65 and older, but by the time you're 85, about a third of individuals will have Alzheimer's dementia. Makes it feel very inevitable for some people. That's just going to be my risk. And we're going to talk a bit about how kind of the beliefs we have make it hard for us to feel like we can change our behaviors and control something that also feels very far away for some of the folks in this room. But the way I like to look at it as a psychologist is that that means 2/3 of individuals who are 85 and above do not have Alzheimer's dementia, and we would like to be in that group. So that's the way to think about that factor. But that is a factor you don't have much personal control over. In fact, you want to live as long as possible. Another factor we can't control for most things in our life is who we're related to. So there is a family risk for developing Alzheimer's dementia in particular. The general rule of thumb that people think about is if you have one family member a first-degree family member. So typically that would be a sibling, or it could be a parent who developed Alzheimer's disease. That does increase your risk above and beyond age alone. And if you have 2 first-degree family members, it definitely increases your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Of course, family history often leads us to think about genes and genetic risk. And there are 2 kind of categories of risk for Alzheimer's dementia that we can think of in the genetic realm. One is more of a deterministic gene. So this would be a disease-causing gene. And in the case of Alzheimer's dementia, there are some, but they account for only about 1% of Alzheimer's dementia. This is not the most common way that individuals get dementia. Typically, when a family has those deterministic genes, it's very clear to the family. There are a lot of cases, and it's typically a much earlier onset of dementia. But that's a low percentage of folks. Much more often, we see the risk genes. And there are around 100 purported risk genes for developing dementia, including Alzheimer's. The most commonly researched, and in fact the one first identified, is the apolipoprotein E gene. Anybody heard of that one? Raise your hand if you've heard of that. A few folks have. ApoE gene. And you can have, you have 2 alleles on this gene. You can have E2, E3, or E4. So you can have any combination amongst those. And it is having either 1 or 2 E4 alleles that confers a risk specifically for Alzheimer's disease. So if you have 1 E4 allele, you have a greater risk. If you have 2, you have a much greater risk. But it's not deterministic. In fact, it probably interacts with some of the other risk factors that we're going to talk about. But there are these risk factor genes. Another risk factor that I'm representing by hormones here, and I'm thinking about lifetime hormone exposure when I talk about this, I'm talking about it from a hormone perspective, but of course the research literature broadly is treating this as biological sex, where we do see in most countries, because Alzheimer's and other dementias are researched globally, we do see a higher risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's dementia, for women than for men. Now, having said that, there is research suggesting hormones play a role in that, lifetime hormones. However, there also are sociocultural elements. So when we think of the global literature on risk, we know there are many countries where women aren't offered the same opportunities to get formal education or to be involved in cognitively stimulating occupations as men are in those countries. So there definitely is a gender sociological element to this as well. And the final risk factor that we don't really have a lot of personal control over is air pollution. So air pollution, both indoor particulate matter and outdoor particulate matter, conveys an increased risk for dementia. Of course, air pollution also increases our risk for a lot of health conditions across our lifespan. So sometimes when we think about these risk factors, particularly those first 3, family history, aging, my genetics, people get really fatalistic about it. They feel like, well, there's not much I can do about it. There's not much I can control. If that were true, would we be here talking today? Probably not. But I think when people think more about that, and I hear this as a clinician and as a researcher, that people's attention moves to, well, it's inevitable, I'm going to get it, so I sure hope they have effective treatments by the time I get it. So let's talk very briefly.
So Julie, this is all forms of dementia. Alzheimer's is the leading one.
Yes.
How many different types of dementia are there? Or am I asking the wrong type of question?
Could we spend all night talking about some of the different kinds of dementia? Yeah, so there are several very, very frequent causes of dementia, but Alzheimer's is by far the most frequent. And then there are other causes, some of which have, like we're going to talk about cardiovascular risk for dementia, specifically for Alzheimer's, but it also is a risk for its own dementia. So most of what I'm going to talk about will be on dementia broadly. But treatment literature has focused predominantly on treating Alzheimer's. So that's where I'm going to turn my attention here. And this is something, although I don't do research on these pharmaceutical approaches, it's something I've followed a lot since the early 90s. So even before I got here in 97, I was working in a neurology clinic, and these were hot topics. And the development of treatment sort of followed a pattern every time. A great deal of excitement. Everybody was very excited. And then the data came in, and our excitement waned. And then we moved to the next kind of attempt to develop some sort of treatment. And that's been very disappointing and heartbreaking. But generally today, we could put the pharmaceutical approaches into two broad camps. That first one, represented by the cholinesterase inhibitors and memantine, are what we could think of as the symptom treatment camp. So these medications were specifically designed to improve cognition, improve your daily functioning. Some of them are, memantine's a lot newer, but there have been lots of different versions of cholinesterase inhibitors over the decades. And generally, the effects are modest at best. They do not stop the Alzheimer's disease process. They unfortunately do not slow the decline. At best, they have a short-term, very modest effect on cognition, and only for a subset of individuals. This second camp is the new and exciting camp, and I think maybe it was one of the reasons that I got on the Science Cafe list, was thinking, ooh, let's find someone who will talk about this. So I will talk about it briefly and then move on to my own research. But I do want to talk about it because it is the story of excitement and disappointment, again, and the need for us to continue to look for effective treatments. We can group them generally together because they all are disease-modifying pharmaceutical approaches. Their goal, in this case, is to remove the amyloid plaques from the brains of individuals who already are showing signs of dementia. They either have mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of a prodromal sign that predicts development of dementia, and again, specifically Alzheimer's in this case, or mild forms of Alzheimer's dementia, and individuals who already show signs of that plaque buildup in their brains. And what they all are, they're all infusion treatments, and they all show some effectiveness at removing plaques in animal studies as well as in human studies. Of course, that's great. But what do we care about? Real-world functioning. We really want to see that these treatments also improve cognition, that they improve functioning, that they delay the onset of functional decline, that they keep people independent, having a good quality of life, right? Well, the first one, how many of you have heard of aducanumab? So this one was in the news in 2021 because it was very controversial. It was pushed through on an accelerated FDA approval, and several experts and scientists quit because of that accelerated FDA approval, and that was because there were two trials, one that showed very minimal cognitive effects in only a subset of their participants, and in the other trial, no effect of the active treatment, and if anything, the placebo group looked like they improved, although it wasn't statistically significant. So two meh trials, to use your young people jargon, and yet it got accelerated approval with the caveat that they had to do a third trial. And that's why it made the news again here this summer in 2024, because the company that was running that third trial discontinued the trial. Didn't quite hear the whole story there, but abruptly discontinued it, and the drug will be discontinued. Now, the other two are more recently FDA approved. In fact, donanemab was this summer. They both received traditional FDA approval. They both have one trial each that showed some, again, minimal effectiveness on cognition. And the trick there is they're very expensive, very, very expensive. Of course, that's why we want FDA approval, so that we can treat people and that insurance might cover it. They're invasive in that they're IV infusions. The case of lecanemab, every 2 weeks. Donanemab is every month. And unfortunately, they have some side effects. In fact, there are some brain pathologies that are seen in individuals who take these medications. And unfortunately, some people who are at genetic risk for developing Alzheimer's, those who have ApoE4 gene that I mentioned earlier, are more likely to show those brain pathologies in the treatment. So we're in an exciting time again where we've developed a whole new approach of disease-modifying treatments. Are we going to see the effects that we really want to see? That's only after you have a diagnosis, you're showing signs of it, and you have plaque buildup in your brain. It doesn't speak to what else can we do, which is prevention. So that's going to be the topic of our talk today. Again, apologies if you can't read these, that's fine. I'm going to blow up each section of this lifespan approach as we talk. But this is a graphic from the Lancet Commission. The Lancet Commission is an international, multicultural group of experts in dementia who have gathered together the data, collected the data, in some cases run their own studies, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, putting together all of the different research designs that can occur to try to identify what are the most consistently, empirically supported risk factors for dementia, and if we could do something about them, how would that affect the global rates of dementia? Again, this is global research that they're representing across the lifespan. So you're going to see some numbers will pop up when I expand each of these slides. This is not your own personal risk being covered. It's not, oh boy, if I address that factor, I will lower my personal risk for developing dementia by this %. The risks are, we think of them as public health, epidemiological, risk reduction at the global level. But I left the percents when I blew up each of these areas because it shows the size of the effect that they feel we can conclude about this literature. So, first spot to be interactive, not questions per se, but answers perhaps, or answers to my question that could earn t-shirts, I don't know, can we shake that up? Sorry to the video audience, you don't get to do that. So the research designs that they're using here, there's a myriad of research designs, but we can put them into two camps, very simplified. One is, again, across the globe, how are we going to gather this data? We're going to have to maybe look at medical records, we're going to have to survey people, ask them questions about what medical risk factors they might have, what medications they're taking, what their lifestyle factors are. We have to follow them over time, see who develops dementia, either self-report or medical records. But at the heart of that data, we're not manipulating anything, right? It's correlational at its heart. Much more complicated than that for you statistics folks out there, but at its heart, it's correlational. So what are some problems with that kind of research? If I'm going to say, for example, there's a midlife factor, smoking's on the list. Smoking correlates with increased risk for dementia later. It's correlational. What are some problems with correlation? I see a hand. Well, hold up.
Correlation does not equal causation.
Oh, a t-shirt for you. All right. Yes. And that hides a lot of the scientific problems with that kind of work. Correlation does not equal causation, even if we're doing longitudinal studies where we're seeing, well, this was here, and then we follow people over time, and we see this. There's a lot of maybe other potential explanations. There could be other factors related. In fact, many of these factors we will talk about, they cluster together. And the Lancet Commission folks acknowledge that in their narrative description of this figure. Well, we're trying to isolate out each factor, but they do kind of cluster together in certain individuals. You're likely to have one more than the other, and so it's hard to say this factor alone might cause something or increase that risk. The other problem that can arise with some of these factors is reverse causation, in the sense that instead of being risks for developing dementia, they may be signs that you have dementia, and that is why they appear. I'm going to talk about that specifically for some of the specific factors and some research that we've been involved in that suggests that. But what's another problem with that? I mentioned smoking. So if I say smoking increases your risk for dementia, what are some problems with reaching that conclusion?
One problem might be if you smoke, you might die early and you might not get to the dementia stage.
Well, that is a problem when we're doing these longitudinal studies in aging generally, right? Because indeed, we lose people. So who stays in the study? It may be that the people who die earlier, of course, they're not continuing in the study. It may be that they've also left the study because they're no longer interested. It might be because they did develop dementia. It might be because they did not. We don't know. We lose a lot of people to follow up, and that can be really hard to track. But another problem with it is dose response is the term I'm going to use for it. How much smoking? What if I smoked for a year in my 20s. Oh, it feels bad to say that. I did not do that. But what if I did? Does that confer increased risk? Or do I have to be a half a pack a day smoker for 10 years, or a pack a day for 20 years, or I didn't start until my 40s? So we're not able to look at some of these factors and really give you that personal sense of, oh, well, this much is this much of a risk. We just can't get that level of data in those kind of correlational studies. Now, another research method that they use is interventional. Not as many of these risk factors are there interventional studies on, but there have been attempts to do interventions. Let's take, for example, diet. The most common interventions that people have done to try to reduce risk for dementia are diet and exercise. So let's say I want to do a randomized clinical trial, and I'm going to randomly assign some of you in this room to a really healthy diet. I'll show you the MIND diet later as an example. And then I'm going to randomly assign the rest of you to what? The ice cream and pizza diet. Sign me up. It's random. We can't do that. But what's the problem with that? Yeah. Microphone up here before you talk.
They could all have different genetic things that would make them, the diet wouldn't be fair, because some could be at a higher risk because of their genetics, while others might not be. Right,
and that's a good factor for us to measure, right? It could be that it's effective for one group than the other. So we would always want to measure those extra characteristics to see, does it work better in those who are at genetic risk or not genetic risk? But what else could be a problem? The problem mentioned earlier about they could die is also a problem here, right? We have to follow people up until the risk age. Yes, in the back there's a person who is going to be a scientist criticizing this research with me.
You can't prove that there's not a prior factor that could be affecting them later?
Well, and what could that prior factor be? What if I'm assigned to the bad diet group, but I eat a good diet? Adherence is an issue, right? I could have a lifetime of healthy eating, and then at what point I'm going to start eating the healthy or non-healthy diet, or I could have a lifetime of eating ice cream and pizza, which sounds really good right now. And then I'm assigned to the healthy diet, but I choose not to follow it. Adherence is a real problem. And in those intervention studies, adherence, especially after the active trial, where they might be paying you and they're tracking your diet for you, and then they're not going to give you that intervention for 20, 30, 40 years, adherence becomes a problem. So again, these are some of the limitations to the literature they're using. But I will say, hurt arm, she's going to look like she has her hand up the whole time. I keep doing it too. No, that's okay. The Lancet Commission has considered all of these methodological weaknesses and limitations when they put this literature together. So they've got 14 factors. There were 12 in 2022. We're up to 14 now that they feel have enough consistent evidence across all these different kinds of designs, regardless of their limitations, to conclude that together, if you were able to address all of them, you could modify either delay the onset or prevent the development of dementia up to 45% of it worldwide. So that's pretty impressive. Let's break these down, though, and along the way, I'll illustrate some of my research in my lab over the years that supports them. Now, the only factor that they identified at early life, which apparently is everything before 40, according to the Lancet Commission, is education. So research does show, in fact, that the longer duration of formal education a person has, the lower their risk for dementias of all types, to go back to Howard's question. Now, remember, this is global research, so this is including countries where there are no opportunities for much formal education, and then including studies in the US where there are wide disparities in formal education. But just calling it education hides some of the important other underlying research, because cognitively stimulating occupations also lower the risk for dementia. And of course, those are confounded with each other, right? A lot of very cognitively stimulating occupations require you to have really a lot of education. Not all of them, but some. In addition, there is research that shows that staying cognitively active from midlife into later life confers or helps to lower your risk for dementia, even if you didn't get a lot of formal education. And as a first-generation college student with lots of relatives who did not finish college, I bolded that. Because we live in a society where many, many folks don't have opportunities for formal education, and staying cognitively active can still mitigate the risk for dementia, even if you don't have that opportunity to go to college or to go to grad school or just keep going to school. Apparently, some of us never left school, according to our family members. So education.
So what's an example of staying cognitively active later in life beyond education?
Well, and we were
Crossword
talking
puzzle?
about that beforehand a little bit, that for a lot of people, they think, oh, I do the crossword and the Sudoku, so I'm cognitively active, but they often become habitual for us, right? It's just, open your app, play the game, or open the newspaper if you're still a newspaper person, do it in ink. Really cognitively stimulating activities when you're older are new and novel and different. So trying things you haven't done before can be much more useful. And as we talk later, another separate factor for the Lancet is social isolation, but within social isolation includes social engagement. So I will come back to that as one of the ultimate cognitively stimulating activities one can do. All right, so let's move to midlife. As you can tell, that's where most of the factors are. And I'm going to break them down. Some I'm going to talk about in isolation, and others I'm going to cluster together because they make sense to cluster together. So, hearing loss. Hearing loss is on the list. It's relatively new. I believe they added it in 2022, where there is a fair amount of research that's consistent enough to suggest that individuals with hearing loss are at higher risk of developing dementia, and that risk can be mitigated by hearing aids, especially if that individual has other risks in addition to just hearing loss. So, what does that suggest? From a treatment perspective, get your hearing checked regularly. If you have hearing problems, wear hearing aids to help yourself with hearing. And from a prevention perspective, it means we need to control our loud noise exposure. Back in 2022, when this one got added to Lancet, I decided, all right, I have to stop listening to music so loud in my car that all my neighbors can hear it, and maybe wear some protection when I mow the lawn, because this is one I wasn't good at. Yes, there's a question over here. Is it related to hearing loss, I assume?
Do you know if this applies at all to people who lost their hearing early on in life, in childhood?
That's a good question. The Lancet put it in the midlife area because they felt the evidence was stronger for developing hearing loss in midlife. Depression. Depression's another factor I'm going to treat in isolation from some of the other factors, because this is one that we've also done some research on. So, depression in midlife increases one's risk for dementia, and there are some pretty consistent studies showing that effective intervention for depression in midlife mitigates that risk. And that treatment could be pharmaceutical, it could be with therapy, it could be with both. Now, I'm specifically mentioning midlife because it's also pretty well documented that you see signs of dementia that seem to predict signs of depression that predict development of dementia in late life. But that is a good example of what we might call reverse causality. So an area of research that really picked up in the last 10 years or so, looking at neuropsychiatric symptoms, which would include things like depression and agitation and withdrawal and even paranoia, has shown that contrary to our popular belief that dementia will present with language problems, it will present with memory problems as a very first sign, that for quite a few individuals, it presents with behavioral changes and psychological changes. So it could be that development of dementia in late life, especially in someone who has no personal risk or family history of dementia or depression, that's actually a sign of the developing dementia than necessarily a causal risk factor. That being said, though, it is true that in midlife depression seems to predict the later development of dementia, and that treatment can help. So again, take-home message, if you're noticing that you're having problems with your mental health, seek mental health care, seek treatment for that, as a long-term kind of risk mitigation. It looks like we might have a question over here. Is it related to the depression findings? Okay. In case the question is why, there's a couple of explanations. It may be that we know that depression is related to some of the other factors, especially withdrawal from cognitively stimulating and socially stimulating activities. We also know that depression often leads to less life care, so you might be in some of these other factors you might be less likely to engage in. We also know it can be related to changes to your HPA axis, which cortisol is related to some changes to the hippocampus, which is related to memory. They're clustered together and they interact with one another. But maybe that wasn't your question.
Is it just depression, or is it other mental illnesses like anxiety or PTSD?
Very, very good question. The most supported psychological factor is depression. That has the most consistent evidence. But things like anxiety in particular, that's in the possibles list. And I am going to talk about a couple of possibles a little bit later, because they have some that they consider possibles, but they don't make the graphic. So the 14 that make the graphic are the most consistent. Good question. Another factor is traumatic brain injury. Now, lest you immediately start thinking of every time you've had a concussion, the Lancet Commission focused specifically on moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. Well, how do you know? What is the difference? The definition of a mild traumatic brain injury, which, by the way, is what a concussion is a blow to your head that led to any sort of signs. It could be seeing stars, ringing in your ears, having a headache, and anywhere from 0 seconds of loss of consciousness to 30 minutes loss of consciousness. Anything above 30 minutes then becomes moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. But 30 minutes of loss of consciousness or less is considered mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. I see some surprised looks on your faces. That's mild traumatic brain injury, and that's not what they studied. They focused their energies on the moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, and indeed that confers a risk. So, very important for you to protect that noggin. Wear your helmets when you're doing activities that put your brain at risk, because it's putting your head at risk, and try to prevent your fall risk, which is a time that people will experience traumatic brain injuries. Now, we have done some research specifically on the question of mild traumatic brain injury and concussion, because it's such a common belief for folks that that's going to increase the risk of dementia later. And in the many, many years that we've done free dementia screens, we've always taken traumatic brain injury history. We've not seen it related to cognitive performance once you're past the acute time period, and we've not seen it related to cognitive decline. And my former graduate student, Dr. Claire Alexander, actually conducted her research using the NAC data set. This is a publicly available data set from national Alzheimer's clinical centers that are memory screening centers across the nation, tens of thousands of participants. And in that data set, she also showed that mild traumatic brain injury did not increase risk for cognitive decline over time or dementia when we started with the individuals who were normal at baseline. Their cognition was normal at baseline, and that was a long 5 to 10 year follow-up of data. So we definitely kind of conferred with them that we shouldn't be worried in the mild traumatic brain injury space. Nevertheless, you don't know what kind of injury you're going to get. Protect your noggin. Now, I've lumped a lot of the other risk factors together that are in that section because they all are related to cardiovascular risk. And I have another slide where I'm going to talk about some of our research on cardiovascular risk. But I wanted to still illustrate them separately. High LDL cholesterol was new to their 2024 list, but the others have been on there for a long time. Diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and high cholesterol, again, conveying risk for development of dementia. And in fact, in the case of hypertension, the Lancet Commission describes antihypertensive medications as the only clearly empirically supported preventive pharmaceutical treatment for preventing dementia. Because controlling your hypertension with antihypertensive medications by midlife on does seem to help really lower the risk. So again, take-home message is if you don't have these disorders, you should be doing lifestyle changes that we're going to come to in just a second to prevent development of them. And if you do have these disorders, checking in regularly to make sure that all of your labs are in the right range, that you're adhering to whatever interventions and medications that are helping you to control that. But again, we're going to come back to cardiovascular risk in a second. I want to talk about the last 3 of the factors that are in this grouping as midlife risk factors, and they're all behavior changes. They're all lifestyle kinds of behavior changes. So physical inactivity, smoking, and excessive alcohol are all related to increased risk for dementia. And again, okay, well, how much smoking and when? Same with excessive alcohol. Although the Lancet Commission tries to recommend an amount that they would consider excessive, it's not really based on super good data, so I chose not to include it. Definitely engaging in binge drinking is not good for your brain at any point in your life. But to suggest that there's a good number and a bad number, and for those of you who follow this kind of literature, that's happened with alcohol over and over again, where it's, oh, during COVID, 1 glass of wine is great, and now it's no glasses of wine ever. So there really isn't a good data to suggest an amount, but definitely having excessive use like binge drinking is conveying a greater risk. When it comes to physical inactivity, I could put physical inactivity and smoking up at cardiovascular risk because we know they're so related to each other. But when it comes to physical activity, it illustrates well a point I'm going to make on the next slide, and that is a lot of studies of individuals who are aging healthfully, as well as individuals who have mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, has shown that moderate to vigorous exercise, as approved by a healthcare provider that you're okay to do, increases blood flow to your brain. And that's really what we want, because a healthy heart and healthy pathways from your heart to your brain are absolutely essential to keeping your brain healthy. Your brain takes 25% of the oxygenated blood from every single one of your heartbeat. It's this little tiny part of your body, and it's taking 25% of every single heartbeat. Every cell in your brain is a factory. They're neurons firing together, wiring together, doing all of these tasks that we're doing right now, and they need energy to do it, and they need good oxygenated and glucosed blood to do it. So, keeping your heart healthy, keeping the pathways from your heart to your brain healthy, absolutely essential. Now, we just finished a study back in May or June that we started at the kind of tail end of COVID. And what we learned during COVID was, of course, we weren't allowed to see some of our research participants in person for quite a few years. And research came out showing that we could do a lot of our dementia screens via teleassessment. So, while many of our participants did not enjoy that and said, please, please go back to in-person. If any of you were in my projects before, I will show you. Sneak peek at a project that will be coming up. You can come back in person again. But we gave teleassessment, and the nice thing about that was we could open it up to all of Ohio to participate. As a part of virtually all of our projects, we do offer clinical feedback about performance. I'm licensed in Ohio, so we do Ohio-based data. So we collected data from about 150 adults, 50 and older, but who all had risk factors for dementia. Either high number of subjective cognitive complaints, cardiovascular risk factors, a family history, some who knew their ApoE4 status, etc. It was pretty liberal definition, but none of them had Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. All were living independently. And we got full medical data on them. We got their medications. We got their psych histories. We got their education histories, their traumatic brain injury histories. And the factor that was most related to cognitive performance was actually the number of cardiovascular risk factors they had. So that list in the Lancet, coupled with having a prior cardiac arrest, for example, and we included smoking in our list of cardiovascular risks, the more of those an individual had, the more cognitive impairment they had. And that cognitive impairment showed up in attention and immediate memory, in psychomotor processing speed, so how quick your gears are turning when you're doing cognitive tasks. Those were the biggest domains that it showed up, as well as a language fluency task, which probably was related to speed. But interestingly and puzzlingly to us, it was only in the individuals who did not have a family history of dementia. We saw it in the folks who did not have the family history of dementia. And that wasn't because those folks were different in any way. In educational status, nope. In terms of general cardiovascular status and risk factors, nope. In terms of general cognition, wasn't the case. We couldn't really find a good explanation. So fruit for future research, we really want to look at that a lot more thoroughly, and we probably will with our follow-up study. So again, just emphasizing the importance of your cardiovascular health for your dementia risk. So let's move to the late life factors that they've identified. There are 3, but we've already covered one. Air pollution is on their list, and there's not much we can do as an individual about that, so I'm going to move past it and talk about the other 2. Social isolation. So social isolation in late life confers an increased risk for dementia, but the words social isolation hide really important things. Because social isolation is related to loneliness, but they're not the same thing. And it's also related to social engagement, but they're not exactly the same thing, right? So a person could have just a few people in their social network, and we would define that as maybe more relatively socially isolated, but they might feel fine with that. They're not lonely at all. And you could have another person who has a big social network and yet feels very lonely. Loneliness is probably more of a mental health variable. Not sure if the person who asked the question about other mental health variables is still here, but that would be another mental health variable generally in late life that seems to be related to risk for dementia. But all 3 of them are related to risk for dementia. So having more people in your social network, feeling less lonely, and being very socially engaged all reduce your risk. And this is back to Howard's question about what kind of cognitive engagement is important. Well, social engagement is very much cognitive engagement. I have to remember what I'm talking about. I have to remember the question that someone asked. I don't know what questions people are going to ask, so I have to be ready to answer them. When there's multiple people, you're holding 2 conversations at the same time or playing cards and having conversation. It's very much a cognitively demanding task. And speaking of cognitively demanding, what's your question?
I was just wondering, how does Down syndrome have a play in this? Because I know that a lot of people who have Down syndrome don't have the opportunity to go out when they're older. If they make it to the older stages of life, how does that affect their risk of getting dementia super on early?
Well, in the case of Down syndrome in particular, trisomy 21, the risk for developing Alzheimer's by the time they're in their 50s is near universal in terms of the pathologies you see in the brain. So they have a disease-related risk that by that age, they often are already showing signs, at least in the brain, and pretty much universally will have dementia by the time they're in their 60s. So unfortunately, late life they're already probably experiencing signs of the illness. And again, there could be a reverse causality to this one too, right? So if you're starting to develop dementia, you're probably not going to spend time with individuals. In fact, I'll talk about one of our studies that showed similar findings to that in a second. And the final factor, this one's brand new in 2024, vision loss. So the Lancet added this one to their list, that individuals who have some age-associated visual losses have an increased risk for dementia, but not all age-associated visual losses. So it turns out it's not related to development of glaucoma, it's not related to development of age-related macular degeneration, but it is related to diabetic retinopathy. That's probably because of the diabetes, right? So the confound there is individuals who don't have well-controlled diabetes for a long enough period of time or have very severe diabetes will experience diabetic retinopathy. That's probably the relationship there. However, the more interesting one is actually cataracts. So individuals with cataracts have an increased likelihood of developing dementia, and while it's not consistent across all intervention studies, there are enough that the Lancet Commission concluded that treatment of cataracts, correcting cataracts, does mitigate that risk. So that's their 14. But to that, they have a lot of possibles. I'm only going to talk about 2. 2 reasons I want to talk about those. They very much illustrate the problems that we talked about in the research. And you all were great research scientists and showed me that you understand some of the problems with the research. But yes, controlling the dose, understanding what time period for how long, getting accurate reports of what the heck people are eating, trying to do interventions on that, these illustrate that well. But they're also controllable, and they may be related to other risk factors. So some of you might have been surprised that I never came back to diet when I suggested, here's randomized clinical trials. What? A healthy diet is not on the list? I can eat anything I want? Indeed, there's not a lot of really good consistent data because how on earth do we measure this? Who's accurate about saying how many leafy greens you eat in a week? I picked that on purpose. I hate leafy greens. I force myself to eat them, but I would probably lie in a survey about how much I eat them if I know I'm supposed to. But it's not just, I eat a healthy diet, yes, no. It's all of these different factors that could or could not be related. And the studies that have tried to look at the Mediterranean diet or what's called the DASH diet, which is specifically for hypertension, or this one's called the MIND diet. It's a blend of those two, but also modified to try to get people to adhere to it. They all show pretty poor adherence. So it's a very hard factor to control. But what we do know is that a healthy diet is associated with a lot of those cardiovascular risk factors that we were talking about. So I leave it on my possibles list because it's something you can do something about and set smart goals about, which we'll talk about in just a second. Last one is sleep. Always disappointing to me that sleep doesn't make it on their list, but I completely understand as a scientist. At what point in your life did you have good or poor sleep? I guarantee you that if you undergrads told me about your sleep right now, I would probably fall to the floor and cry because you're not sleeping well. But maybe you'll sleep better when you get older. At what point does sleep matter, and what aspect of sleep? Is it short sleep, way too short of sleep? Is it too long of sleep? Is it the quality of sleep? Is it sleep apnea? The best evidence out there is if you sleep for too short a period of time, well under the 7 that you should be getting at least at a minimum, and if you have sleep apnea that's not treated, those increase your risk for dementia. But as outside of that, it's really hard to get a handle on good sleep or poor sleep. However, I wanted to leave sleep on here because it is something you can improve at any age. And a lot of animal research as well as human research shows that sleep could be disease modifying. Think back to that slide about pharmaceutical approaches. The disease-modifying treatments are removing the plaques from the brain. So does good sleep. The deepest stages of sleep are actually the time that you have increase in cerebral spinal fluid production, and it is flushing basically dead cells and other detritus from your brain, including the plaques. And there's lots of reasonable human-based research as well that is now supporting that. So it has an underlying mechanism that makes a lot of sense, that should help convince you I need to make sure I get the best quality of sleep I can. For those of you who are older, yes, our sleep gets worse as we get older. It's very well documented. Yes, you can do something about it to make it better. So, having said that though, very briefly, adherence. As psychologists, we also research why is it so hard for humans to change their behavior? Well, a big part of that is temporal discounting. Who's heard of temporal discounting? Yeah, many people have because of the marshmallow test, where you leave a little kid with one marshmallow and tell them, I'm going to come back later and then you can have 2. Not a great way to test it, but that is what is done with little kids. But we're all vulnerable to this. Like right now, I have been in a cafe for an hour, and my favorite things on earth are caffeine and chocolate. And I could smell caffeine, and y'all were having lattes and mochas and ice cream, and I could go get one as soon as I'm done talking and be the happiest person on earth. And then 5 to 6 hours from now, I will not be able to sleep. So if I have a really longer-term goal, in the case of hours, to get better sleep, I should make sure that I'm resisting temptation right now. But it's very hard. As humans, we really struggle with that. Put off something that's very rewarding right now in order to reach a goal that feels kind of far away. Well, what kind of goals are we talking about here? Decades away for some of us. Decades away. So it's very hard for us to set those goals if we're thinking, right now at this age, I'm going to reduce my risk for something that's a long way away, even if for some of us it's less far away. So what can help you do that? Well, it is truly never too late to start. Think that these are automatic habits. You need to spend time motivating yourself to do them and developing new habits. Always helpful to have an accountability buddy, so some support groups where you tell them what you're trying to do, because they can help encourage you. But the big thing is to make a SMART goal. So a SMART goal is specific. I'm not going to say, I'm going to improve my diet. You need to say specifically what you're doing. And it has to be measurable. So I can't just say, I'm going to increase my leafy greens, since I brought that up and I know I need to do that. It needs to be measurable in some way, how often, how much, but it also has to be attainable. I'm not going to set a goal that I know I won't do, because what do I do psychologically? I then fail at the goal. And see, that's too hard. You make it something attainable. It should also be realistic and relevant. So can I find something relevant to me? Can I find some recipes that I could put it in that make it more personally pleasing? Can I tie it to my future goals more directly so that I know it's realistic and relevant for me? And the T in SMART is time-based. Set not only a goal of what you're going to do in a day or what you're going to do in a week, but it gives you something to measure. You can keep track of it. You can put it on a calendar. And lots of studies show that when you make a SMART goal, be that about your homework, undergrads, or a paper you need to write, or about a lifestyle change, that does help you adhere. Lots of research shows that. Now, another big issue with adherence has to do with behaviors that are related to motivation for behavior change. That was part of the study I mentioned to you that we just finished in the spring. We found a lot of the same factors that research from the intervention studies show are related to adherence are also related to motivation. So depression, being generally younger, is related to not being motivated to make any behavior changes. So addressing depression is really important to help motivate people to change their behavior. We also found that individuals with higher cardiovascular risk factors don't want to engage in diet or exercise changes or engage in social activities. So as a psychologist, that's worth exploring. How can we minimize that relationship for folks to increase their motivation? And when it comes to cognitive impairment, individuals with subjective cognitive complaints are much less likely to be motivated to do either cognitive or social engagement. That's an important psychological intervention for us to help develop then. People's unwillingness to go out and do social things, probably because they perceive themselves as having cognitive impairment. And people's actual cognitive impairment in that study was related to less likelihood of engaging in cognitively stimulating activities. So we're going to use that data to help inform development of interventions as we move forward. And we also gathered data, qualitative data, on barriers to engaging in those changes. Because we live in a world where there's a lot of disparities. And we were able to get this data across rural and urban settings of Ohio in individuals who are experiencing different disparities. And my undergraduate student, Elise Grant, is coding that data. And she is taking a look at, well, what are the barriers that folks are, this will be her honors thesis, what barriers are people identifying for different lifestyle changes so that, again, we can address those in some future interventions. With that, I'm going to just leave you with a couple of our studies. I'm going to flip specifically just to this last one. We have some ongoing studies. For those of you who've been in my studies before, this will be our next new rendition that you can do online or in person for those of you who have left me messages saying, when's my free dementia screen? And we're going to focus specifically on language impairment in this study, but we will do a full cognitive screen, 50 and older, not currently with mild cognitive impairment or dementia, and we are actually going to look at APOE4 status in that study. So that will be up and coming. If you're interested, again, you can drop by, let me know. And the other thing I want to plug, our lab also walks in the Walk to End Alzheimer's. So we have a team. We'd love to have you join us, but you can also form your own team. That is coming up in exactly a month. If you're interested, I can give you more information about the walk as well. We'd love to have you join our team or make your own. With that, I think we have a few minutes for other questions and maybe a couple T-shirts left. I don't know, maybe.
One T-shirt left.
One
Here's the
T-shirt
question
left.
right here.
Oh, my goodness.
Hi. So earlier on one of the slides you mentioned sleep apnea.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you knew anything about like the percentage of those diagnosed with sleep apnea early in life and how that affects like how many of them end up getting dementia?
Well, first of all, early in life, I'm assuming you mean before midlife, because most of the data is sort of at a midlife level. But there is a lot less study of individuals who are diagnosed in early life with apnea. This is another great example of dose response, though, right? Because a lot of people don't adhere to treatment for their obstructive sleep apnea. We see a lot of folks, I worked in a sleep clinic for a long time too. People were very reluctant to use the devices. Except when they did for long enough, boy, did they find their cognition changed. And in fact, we did a sleep study right before COVID. Unfortunately, COVID shut it down, so we had a lot less participants than we wanted. But the folks who had sleep apnea, only about 50% of them were willing to use their CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure, for those of you who don't know. And those who did not adhere had much worse cognitive performance than those who did. But even when we took sleep apnea out of the equation, those with poor sleep also showed poorer cognition. But sleep apnea, a lot of it depends on the amount thank you, that you're experiencing at night. And so the dose response for any person is how severe is it? Because people can have very mild doses, especially in later life. Very common to have a mild postural obstructive sleep apnea, so it depends on what position you're sleeping in, and you could maybe fix it with position. But there aren't as many studies at the, developing it really early in life. But adherence to treatment helps cognitively. Yeah.
All right, let's say thank you,
Oh,
and
sure.
maybe you'll stick around for a few more questions.
Questions if people have questions.
Thank you, Dr. Suhr.
Sure.
Fascinating. Thank you.